Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming today. It's great so many of you have been able to join, and I'm very pleased to be doing this afternoon. So this is the first in a series of 3 webinars that the Department for Education is hosting um, around the topics of sexual abuse and harassment. And the first one is going to be about domestic abuse and coercion. Um, just to give you a bit of background about how we got here with this. I mean, it doesn't seem possible that it's almost a year since the advent of the Everyone's Invited website, and then Ofsted's report soon after that, and it brought RSHE into sharp focus, and one of the key learning points for us in the department was that we've got this curriculum, but some of it is actually quite difficult to teach, and in particular subjects that to link to sexual abuse and harassment are sensitive and complex, and can be quite daunting going into a classroom and talking about those subjects to groups of young people. So we wanted to create some small opportunities involving some experts to talk about particular subjects that are sensitive but very crucial to be discussing in the classroom, and that's what we're doing today. And I'm really pleased to give you a very interesting agenda today. I'm going to do some domestics and then talk you through the agenda, and then without further ado hand over to our first speaker. So I don't know if you've done this kind of thing before, but you can't be heard. So to communicate with us, you need to leave a comment or ask a question in the comments. So you can have your speakers on or whatever, and it's fine. You won't hear any background noise. There's going to be a set of slides that would take us through the presentations, and they will be sent to you at the end, so you'll have those for reference. We're also going to be recording this so that if anyone who's missed it can download it from the PHSE Association's website, and that will be available for you to listen to and use after the event. Questions, you're bound to have some questions throughout the presentations, but obviously it's a very big group of you signing into this today. So what we're going to try and do is pick some of the most pressing and interesting questions, a couple of them at the end of each session, if there are any, and then at the end there'll be time for a panel discussion, and we'll select some questions to ask to everybody and get answers to you. But please put your questions on there, because we will be looking at them after this event and hope to send some information to address any outstanding ones after the event to you. You'll also receive a evaluation sheet about 6 o'clock tonight. That should come to your inboxes, and there should also be a link to it available on your screen. So before we start, I'm just going to quickly go through the agenda. We've got an hour and a half, so we should be finished at 5:30. We're going to open, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, Nicole Jacobs, to open. We're going to move on to a presentation from Nicole's and Sally Stedman from Safe Young Lives programme. And we're then going to move on to colleagues at the PHSE Association, who will be talking about curriculum sequencing, and also very pleased to welcome John Makepeace, who's Deputy Head at Norwood Green Junior School in Hounslow, who's going to talk about his experiences. So we've got a very exciting agenda ahead, and without further ado, I'm going to stop talking and extend a very warm welcome to Nicole Jacobs, who's going to start the presentations today. Thanks,
Great.
Nicole.
Thank you very much, Penny. Or Paula, I'm sorry. It's wonderful to be here. And I understand there are many hundreds of you on the other end of this virtual meeting. And it's really a thrill to know that and to understand how many people I'm talking to and how many people are playing such a critical role in shaping how this part of the curriculum is being implemented in school. So You may not have met me before or heard me speak, so I wanted to just introduce a moment or two about the Office of the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, and give a little bit of context to that role. My office was created as part of the Domestic Abuse Act, which had a long journey through the parliamentary process, partly because we had kind of in the middle of it a proroguing of Parliament, a change in government, and then of course COVID. And so I won't blame you, and in particular for the year you have likely had. And I thank you, and should pause to thank each and every one of you for all the incredible work you've done day to day in the last couple of years. I won't blame you if you haven't followed every bit of the Domestic Abuse Act, but it was passed in late April. It's become law. It received royal assent, and part of that act created the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office, so giving it a statutory underpinning. So you may have more likely have heard of the Children's Commissioner, the Victims Commissioner. There are other commissioners in government. We are not party political, we're public appointees, but we're hosted by government as an arm's length body. So we're independent, but also very close, and I hope day-to-day advising government on all sorts of issues in relation to our remit. And for me, that is very much about the incredible range about which domestic abuse touches across government. I think very often people think of this as a criminal justice issue, but of course we have a huge amount to talk about today, as we would across housing, health, family court, the whole range of places where you will see the need for real improvement in terms of how we address domestic abuse. So the Domestic Abuse Act did a few important things in establishing my office. It allows my office to have a couple of statutory powers. One is an ability to seek information from public bodies, so a legal duty for public bodies to cooperate with my office when we're seeking information. And also an ability for my office to make recommendations to public bodies that have to be responded to within 56 days. So each commissioner is a little bit different, but in particular, government has given my office these powers partly in recognition of the fact that we in all ways are really slightly lagging behind. If we think about the harm and the prevalence of domestic abuse, most of our frontline systems were not built with that understanding in mind, and we have a long way to go to really have that systemic change that we need to really offer support as early as possible and even come near the idea of preventing domestic abuse. I want to acknowledge, though, I mean, before I would have been appointed, I worked at the local level for many, many years. I worked in frontline services, some of which are very similar to what you may hear after I finish speaking today. And I have seen so many changes and so much good work done in schools over the years. There have been champions at the local level that have created partnerships with specialist domestic abuse services. There's Operation Encompass, which is about that kind of very early communication if there's been a police incident in the home. There's all sorts of work that safeguarding leads do, and safeguarding partnerships at the local level do. I know of head teacher networks who've created time and space to talk about domestic abuse and raise awareness amongst each other. Safeguarding leads do that as well. And also within citizenship and arts and education, there's so many really interesting and innovative examples. So I wouldn't want to leave you with the impression that I'm not aware that those things have been happening. And I would, in fact, encourage you to let us know collectively about the really good practice that you've been involved in and that you see. Because I do think one of the great curiosities I've had since I've becoming domestic abuse commissioner is really understanding the range of practice. And as we move into much more kind of mandatory aspects of the curriculum, bringing that really excellent practice to the fore, making sure that that's not lost to us more at the national level. And when we think about the support and the range of support that's needed, really having those examples made aware to us as we try to influence and really drive change. So that's partly my plea to you, but also my acknowledgement of the kind of work that you've been doing. As the commissioner, I just want to make sure I don't leave this opportunity with you to just explain a little bit about what you can expect from me in terms of my office and how it connects to your day-to-day. As I said, I'm a government appointee. I have been bestowed some of these really important powers of the role, and on kind of a day-to-day basis, I'm really looking at, number one, the implementation of the Domestic Abuse Act, which of course gives us our first statutory definition of domestic abuse, very importantly, including children in their own right as victims of domestic abuse, which is a huge important change and a shift for all frontline services to be taking on board. The Act, I probably won't outline every aspect of it. There's a lot of moving parts in the Domestic Abuse Act. It creates a statutory duty for housing or accommodation-based services for the first time. So that's a real step forward. So often services for domestic abuse have been quite vulnerable to funding cuts over time, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But at least for accommodation-based services, there's a statutory duty. There's some new offenses in the Domestic Abuse Act which are coming into effect. One is non-fatal strangulation. Another is threats of sharing indecent images. A third is coercion and control after separation. So before the Domestic Abuse Act, there was an offense of coercion and control, but you had to currently be in the relationship. And now there's an amendment to that, which allows for charges to be laid if it's post-separation as well, for using those coercion and controlling behaviors. There's a lot of changes that allow for improvements to the family court, to the criminal court. I would hope that just in general, for us all, just to know some of those changes are afoot and working. I also work across government, so there's a lot to do with kind of creating a thread of opportunity to make sure that things that government is highly investing in are really meaningful for those who are victims of domestic abuse. Family hubs is a great example. The health and well-being strategies within the Department of Health. Of course, all of our work within the Home Office or MOJ with policing and the criminal justice system. There's so much work that requires that eye to domestic abuse. I'm sure it would not surprise you to know that domestic abuse is the most common reason people call the police. Domestic abuse is the most cited reason children in social care get involved with families. This is a highly prevalent crime that we're starting to wake up to as a society, and we need to have a shift to a much more mainstream, resourced, mainstream approach for all services to really adjust those differences between the prevalence and the harm that this crime and these acts cause, and the kind of efforts and the resource and the attention it gets in any number of frontline services. We're mapping domestic abuse services in my office. It's one thing that the legislation actually requires us to do, and of course I want to do, because one of the things that is a challenge for you at the local level is that the partnerships you wish to create with domestic abuse specialist charities and services will differ from place to place, and their funding timescales will differ, or there'll be a huge challenge. Sometimes these services, although we're highly dependent on them, they struggle to survive year in, year out, never sitting in core budgets. And that's one of the big changes and the fundamental changes we need to see. Services for children, for adult survivors, for perpetrators to have opportunities to change. We have we use this term a lot, but it's true in this case, a postcode lottery in most places where we do not have a consistent kind of core funding and strategic way that we sustain those level of services. And that is something that my office is very concentrated on in mapping. We've done a big public survey that just closed in recent weeks for survivors themselves to tell us in England and Wales what are the kinds of services that they want. What did they want when they were trying to approach services? Did they ever get there? And what did they want versus what they were offered? And so we're really hoping through the Victims Bill this year to make a case for that much more sustained funding. And I hope that that helps you in the kind of partnerships that you are wishing to develop at the local level. We're also doing a lot of work in family court. So you will know from having such a lot of access to families and children, you know, it probably won't surprise you, but we know that about 60% of families that end up within family court proceedings are alleging domestic abuse. And yet we have a very little understanding of how our practice directions in court, how CAFCAS practice, judicial decisions across the board. There's a lack of consistent understanding. There's obviously some great practice, but we have a lack of consistent understanding. And the government itself has acknowledged this in a report that was published called the Harm Panel Report. I'll put it in the chat after I'm finished. And one of the recommendations in that report is asking my office to create a reporting mechanism that would be continual to really have much more transparency and oversight about how domestic abuse is dealt with within the family court. A third priority I'm going through 4 just to give you a sense. A third priority is migrant survivors. You may see this in school as well, where you may have families where you know that there is limited recourse to public funds. There'll be real fears of some families who worry about their immigration status, information about them being passed along to immigration enforcement, for example. And there's quite a lot of work we're doing in our office to really bring together information so that government can make some very strategic decisions about how to provide safety for people in those situations, and more ability to access domestic abuse services in particular. And a last is creating an oversight mechanism. So since 2011, we've conducted domestic homicide reviews in every, it's meant to be every domestic related death, and also suicide, which sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't and needs some improvement. So there's a lot of information, and some of that relates to schools, and some of that relates to a lot of the services that you will see in and around you that families really require. If they're experiencing domestic abuse. And so we're creating an oversight mechanism that really helps to make sure that the actions in those reviews, but also other reviews, child safeguarding reviews, mental health reviews, any actions related to domestic abuse are getting done. So obviously, I hope that that helps some of the environment sitting in and around the work that you're doing. And certainly we have a concentration on our policy team at the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office on exactly what you are doing. So we would like, and I would like to make sure that as we continue into this year in particular, that we work with the Department of Education with all of the associate, you know, the PSHE, Association and so many others, and also hear your suggestions as to what will help support you the most in your day-to-day efforts. We do a lot of work in my office with local safeguarding boards, local strategic partnerships that address domestic abuse, and we communicate with them fairly regularly. I would like to know the best of what's happening at the local level in particular, so I can help amplify that and really support to see that happening in more places. So I hope you feel that message has got through to you today, how much I really want to hear what you feel is really working day to day. I obviously support and, you know, found I wasn't shocked, but I found very alarming, as we all would have, the Ofsted review in relation to sexual abuse in schools and colleges. I know that some of that work has highlighted, you know, some of the need to build confidence within safeguarding leads and teaching staff. I can highly relate to that, having worked at the local level for so long. And I really welcome this webinar series in particular, but also the RSHE guidance that the department is working on, and that, you know, we hope to really support and give as much input to as much as possible. I'd also want to highlight to you a couple of other things. One is the statutory guidance that we should be expecting any day, that is part of the Domestic Abuse Act that runs along the Domestic Abuse Act. That will have information in it that is really relevant to you, and it's something that we're hoping that will be published any day. In March, we hope to see, again, I don't have a specific date, but I really hope to see the domestic abuse strategy published. That should have in it a really strong emphasis on a lot of the things that I've touched on, but also prevention, what good prevention looks like. We're doing some work with the Youth Endowment Fund, which is really looking at kind of what is an evidence-based approach to how we prevent violence, in particular domestic abuse and all of the associated issues in terms of for young people in particular. So there's some really interesting work afoot, and some potential levers that we all have that I think will really help us into the future. So having said all of that, it's now time to shift to some really practical things that are being done that I can't wait to hear about a bit more as well myself, to give us ideas and inspire us about kind of the future of what good looks like in this area and the kinds of things that we are endeavoring to build together. So I will pause there. I'll come back at the end for a few moments to reflect. But again, a huge thank you to the department and to ministers for really making sure that these webinars are happening, and for you for attending. And I will pass back to Paula now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was a really comprehensive and an introduction. And just to, before we pass on to the next session, somebody asked a question around. A lot of our speakers will talk about interesting links and things that you can go and read up on. We'll make sure that they're sent out to you as part of your post-event pack. They'll either be part of the slides or as a separate sheet, but we'll make sure we get those to you. Okay, so without further ado, our next speakers are from Safe Lives. So I'd like to welcome Nanya Coles and Sally Stedman South, who are the joint leads of the Safe Young Lives programme.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really pleased to be able to talk with you today on domestic abuse and the experiences of children and young people. As we've already been introduced, I'm Nanya, and my colleague Sally are going to be talking today around, and we're the Safe Young Lives programme leads at Safe Lives. We lead the young people's work. So Safe Lives is a UK-wide charity dedicated to ending domestic abuse for everyone and for good. We combine data, voice and practice throughout our work. This means putting the survivor's voice at the heart of everything we do, focusing on the whole family, helping people to become safe sooner, and challenging perpetrators to change. Combining our national data, research and expertise to help services improve and influence policymakers. We train domestic abuse professionals and provide support and knowledge to frontline staff and commissioners. So what is domestic abuse? I'm going to read out the UK government definition of domestic abuse. It's any incident or pattern of instance of controlling, coercive, threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are or have been intimate partners or family members, regardless of gender and sexuality. The abuse can encompass, but it's not limited to, psychological, physical, sexual, financial and emotional abuse. As Nicole mentioned already, the Domestic Abuse Act recognises children for the first time. So this new Act in 2021, it's an important change which was strongly advocated for by organisations across domestic abuse and children and young people sectors. But we also know that young people also experience abuse in their own relationships. And although they sit outside the definition of domestic abuse, if they're under 16, it's still an important thing that you might come in contact with in your roles in school. Over the next couple of slides, I'm just going to talk through lots of numbers and lots of data. There's lots of information which helps to identify the extent of domestic abuse in the UK. The data is mostly from the Crime Survey for England and Wales and the Safe Lives Insights dataset, which is an outcomes measurement tool. It's completed by domestic abuse services on the intake to service and then on the exit when they leave services. So it encompasses quite a lot of information. We can see that every year over 2 million adults in the UK suffer some form of domestic abuse. On average, victims wait 3 years before getting the effective support that they need. And 85% of domestic abuse victims seek help 5 times on average before they get effective support. And 2 women a week are killed off by a current or ex-partner in England and Wales. And only one in 5 victims of partner abuse will call the police. So these statistics are really important, not only in showing us how wide the spread of the issue is, but also because they show that there's lots of missed opportunities. So we can see with the 1 in 5 only contacting the police, we can see that actually you're likely to come in contact with either victims or their families, and the time that they ask you or seek support might be one of the few opportunities that they're actually seeking support, and we can reach people sooner and earlier by acting on those. This slide is talking about domestic abuse and how it affects the whole family. And your role in working with children and young people, you'll come into contact with children living in the households of domestic abuse. At the time they start school, at least one child in every classroom will have been living with domestic abuse since they were born. And on average, children and young people will have experienced domestic abuse at home for 6 years and 2 months before having some sort of support. There's 831,000 children in England are living in households with domestic abuse. And children might also suffer direct harm themselves. So domestic abuse has been identified as a factor in 2/3 of serious case reviews. And 44% of children experiencing domestic abuse in their home will also be directly abused, with the average duration of direct abuse being 4 years and 10 months. Around 40% of children in households supported by an IDFA, so that's a domestic abuse worker, were not known to children's services. And in 1/5 of cases, the child tried to intervene to stop the abuse. Now, we know that the definition of domestic abuse is 16+, but as I mentioned earlier, children and young people will also be experiencing abuse in their own relationship. The data around this, there's not a huge amount of data in terms of direct numbers, partly because it's not in the definition, but from the Crime Survey in England and Wales, we can see that the lower end of the age scale, so 16 to 19-year-olds, are disproportionately affected by domestic abuse. And then the assumption would be that that is also below that as well. I think I've whistled through my slides, and I'm going to pass on to Sally.
Thanks, Anya. Okay, so I'm just going to rattle through the next couple of slides because I kind of want to get on to talk to you about what young people have told us. And that's the bit that I think can really help you when you think about the implementation of the RSE curriculum and just in your everyday conversations with children and young people you're in contact with. But I need to set the scene a little bit for that. So some time ago as an organisation, we started to think more broadly about what our response should be to domestic abuse, and we started to think more whole picture, so thinking about all the needs and the issues that an individual will have, so not just thinking about domestic abuse and how they exist within a family, often quite a broad family network. Well, there'll be multiple needs and issues, and also thinking about how we need to develop more robust and systemic interventions for all members of the family. So not just thinking about victims and children as victims, but thinking about perpetrators and young people who might be harming as well, and thinking about what interventions and solutions we can offer in that space. But then also just really importantly about how these families and these individuals might sit within a community and a society which can highlight quite and exacerbate quite already complicated issues and problems that families have, and how, you know, if you're an individual, particularly if you might have additional needs, you know, around disabilities or mental health needs, or substance misuse problems, you might have mental health support needs. Also thinking about how issues like racism, homophobia can kind of intersect with how families are also then dealing with domestic abuse. That creates quite a complex picture to unravel and to support, but it's one that we need to see. It's something that survivors have told us, that they do need professionals to see them as a whole person with all of those needs, and not just see them in silos or as single issues. And that can be quite complicated, kind of, and feel quite overwhelming for you as a teacher, or, you know, for individual practitioners, when you might only be interacting with one person within that family unit. But it is still important that we see that broader picture. You might not be able to see all of this on your screen, but we're sharing these slides afterwards. But really, this is about how we then move that understanding on, and think about children and young people, and how really, as part of our strategic priorities as an organisation, is about trying to move that needle towards thinking about intervening earlier and sooner, and trying to act before someone is harmed and before someone harms as well. And so really wanting to try and create an understanding and interventions about how children and young people, particularly young people in their early relationships, they're interacting at a point which is a period of like great risk often for young people. They might be kind of testing out what's acceptable and what isn't. They might be starting to kind of use certain behaviours and adopt and establish patterns of behaviour which might last a lifetime for them. And so it's really important that we, as kind of schools and as teachers, that we see you as a really important part of the response to children and young people, you know, as an opportunity to intervene earlier and sooner, to really start having these conversations, like, you know, through whatever opportunities you have in schools, to you know, to prevent harm from happening. Essentially, we really see schools as part of that coordinated community response, and they really can help educate children and young people on, you know, on the kind of understanding about violence against women and girls, and that's really important conversation to be having within schools. You know, you're so important around like influencing the thoughts and beliefs and attitudes of children and young people, especially when what they might be experiencing and seeing at home might be quite at odds with what they're seeing and being taught in schools. So what you can see on your screen, if you can see any of it, because it's quite small, is really about us, you know, seeing children and young people, recognising that their individual needs, and how their exposure to certain things within their family, their friendship groups, their community and their society can really kind of influence and shape them. But really at the heart of this and of our work with children and young people are their voices, are their experiences, which again, they're telling us they don't want to be seen as this homogenous group. They have individual needs and experiences and they want to be understood. So I'm just going to quickly touch on some of our projects, our Safe Young Lives projects. So we have our SOS project, which is about giving young people a platform to talk about what's important to them and really influence change at a local and national level. We've got our Verge of Harm projects, which comes under the Voices of Men and Boys. And again, that's about really reaching into the experiences of men and boys, you know, the harm that they might be using and perpetrating, understanding their views on masculinity and like seeing them as part of the solution around ending male violence towards women and girls. We've got Your Best Friend, which I'll touch on in a second when I talk about some of the research and what young people have told us, and our RSE curriculum. Again, another research piece which is about understanding the implementation of the RSE curriculum and how young people are experiencing that and how teachers are finding their way through that. So young people at different points of our work with them have told us through whether it's surveys, whether it's like being involved in co-creating solutions, whether it's focus groups, have told us their experiences. And this particular slide focuses on our Talk About Toxic survey, which we managed to evolve a platform called Draw the Line, which we'll share with you afterwards, but it can be a really useful way of like helping young people to think about where the line is in their relationships, in their friends' relationships, in relation to what is healthy and unhealthy behaviours in certain relationships. So we ran this in partnership with On Our Radar, and there's close to 500 young people's voices that underpin these key messages. And I think it's just important to kind of come back to the point that Nanya raised in terms of the current definition of domestic abuse is 16 plus, but all of these voices and experiences of young people are from 13 onwards, and we know that this is still a significant and serious issue for young people under the age of 16. So I just wanted to kind of flag that as we go through. The NSPCC research some time ago talked about around a quarter of girls aged 13 to 17 and a third of boys had experienced, a third of them had experienced sexual pressures and unwanted sexual acts, and a quarter of them had experienced physical violence and abuse. And 75% of girls and 50% of boys had talked about experiencing emotional abuse. So this is a significant issue for young people. So in the survey, they talked about not knowing where the line was. So not knowing that when a relationship tips into becoming healthy or unhealthy. So around half of young people in the survey, and this varied slightly according to gender and sexuality, said that they wanted help around understanding what is and isn't okay. And I think in terms of the important messages that need to be delivered in within the RSE curriculum and conversations around domestic abuse and intimate relationships is helping them understand that and navigate that. Young people wanted to know about what they could do, so how they could help, and how they could support friends as well in that. So they wanted help to identify what abuse was. Their experience, they wanted to acknowledge that their experience was unique. So we know from the crime survey for 16 plus young people that young people are disproportionately affected by domestic abuse. So they wanted acknowledgement of that's a real problem for them in their relationships. But that importantly, they don't always identify with the term domestic abuse. So they often talk about toxic, and that's the name of our survey as a result of that. So I think in terms of like using language that they can engage and understand is really important. Young people also don't necessarily want to access traditional domestic abuse services, so they want, you know, services for them, for, you know, as a young person. They often want to talk to friends. They sometimes want to talk to family members, and sometimes they want to talk to teachers as well. So they told us that in their surveys. But then they're also quite conscious that when talking to teachers, that conversation might not always be able to stay within them, that there are safeguarding duties that teachers have, and so there's sometimes a hesitancy to make certain disclosures. So I'm just going to move on to my next slide, and it'll be my last one for people keeping time. In terms of another project, and this is a current project we've got running with lots of resources that are coming out through a campaign called #FriendsCanTell. It's called Your Best Friend, and again, some of the really important messages that young people wanted us to get across today was around the help that they needed to denormalise coercive and controlling behaviours. So in the survey, there was around 650 young people who took part in this, and there was extreme levels of coercive controlling behaviour coming out in their experiences, psychological manipulation, and how that was being used to kind of maintain control in relationships. That young people wanted advice to help keep themselves safe when connecting with people and starting relationships online. So even if they were meeting each other at school and they knew each other in like the offline world, that often they might connect and link online. And when they do that, they're often bombarded with quite significant online pressures and exposure to unwanted personal sexual comments, like being asked for nudes, receiving unwanted sexual images, and people, you know, not having unwanted people messaging them. So around 70% of young people in the survey experienced that. And that was more significant if you were older, but still a significant issue for 13 to 15-year-olds as well. But the majority of young people said that fear and doubt would stop them from talking about it and from helping a friend. So I think in terms of, again, messages for young people to hear, it's important that a non-judgmental and non-pressurizing approach is taken, you know, and that they're encouraged to kind of be like that with their friends when they're talking about the issues and helping their friends to identify these toxic behaviours as well, if that's what young people are trying to do. As part of the project, we're really trying to place resources and support where young people are and really making sure that they're accessible. So whether that's making sure that they're accessible in terms of, you know, reaching into certain communities and cultures. You know, we've got young people involved in the project, you know, that are evolving resources as young Black and Asian minority ethnic young people, as young disabled people, you know, really wanting to make sure that they're accessible and engaging, and that they exist in online and offline spaces as well. I think just one final point is about making sure that there's when you're talking about these issues within schools, that there's a real clear route to the trusted adult, so that young people can raise the concerns at the earliest opportunity. So there was a hesitancy often for young people to want to talk about with a trusted adult what they might be seeing in their own relationships or their friends' relationships until it escalated to quite a high, serious level. And obviously what we're trying to do as part of our work is to try and give them the tools, the insights, so that they start to do that sooner and earlier. So, and then knowing how they can seek help, specialist help, is also a really important part of that conversation. So we say all of that without wanting to create more pressure for schools, because we know how hard it is to kind of deliver all of this, you know, almost specialist curriculum around, you know, it's that broader kind of umbrella of violence against women and girls, but also thinking about how young men and boys are also experiencing and using harm But we know schools are a really important partner in helping us, helping us share these messages with young people around their understanding about gender-based violence and abuse, and about how young people can be part of ending domestic abuse for good, really, which is obviously our long-term goal. So I'm going to stop there. We've got another slide which is just resources that we can share with you afterwards, but I'm just really conscious of time, so I'm going to hand back.
Thank you so much, Sally and Nanya. And move on to the next session. Pleased to welcome colleagues from the PHS Association, Bethan Miller, and she's joined by John Makepeace, who's Deputy Head Teacher at Norwood Green Junior School in Hounslow, and they're going to talk about curriculum planning and teacher practice. Many thanks.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Paula, and thank you to the previous speakers, as well as everyone else who is here attending this. I'm Bethan Miller. I'm one of the subject specialists at the PSHE Association, the national body for PSHE education. I'll be exploring some of the ways that you can embed teaching about relationships and domestic abuse into your curriculum, as well as some top tips for the classroom. And then I'll be handing over you over to John Makepeace from Norwood Green Junior School, who'll be sharing some of his classroom practice with you. Sorry, if we can move on to the next slide, my clicker's not quite showing up. But there we go. So as Nanya and Nicole have already discussed, the definition of domestic abuse has been recently updated as part of the Domestic Abuse Act. And we can think about how this then affects how we frame this in the classroom. So in terms of the types of abuse that we might want to explore and enable young people to recognise, especially as they start to form their own relationships, there are a range of behaviours, some of which are more often identified in teaching than others. So, for example, economic aspects are often overlooked in our teaching. We can also think about the ways that in some situations, the young person themselves is used as a means of abuse towards an adult in their home, and reflect that within our teaching and make sure that we are helping young people to understand that it's not acceptable for them to be acted towards like that. As it's already been explained, the definition for domestic abuse is for people over 16. However, we also know that young people who experience domestic abuse are now recognised as victims in their own right. What we also want to make sure when we're exploring domestic abuse is that we're considering the range of relationships that could be involved in that, including that reflecting the diversity of sexual orientation that our young people experience, and think about the relationships that they themselves would have. Of course, as schools in general, we can support children through our safeguarding approaches, how we manage disclosures, how we can identify children who might be experiencing domestic abuse. We can think about how we support the relationships between children and their peers, as well as their teachers, and we can refer them to relevant in-school and external support services. But we can also think about what PSH education specifically can do in relation to learning about domestic abuse, as well as the limitations of it. So in terms of PSH education, we can help children to keep themselves safe and help to keep themselves safe, because of course they don't have that responsibility on their own, by recognising healthy and unhealthy relationship behaviours in their own early relationships, as well as understanding when they can seek support. And importantly, we can help to foster those positive relationship behaviours and help people to understand respectful relationship scripts, which can be really important, especially if they're not regularly seeing those within their own lives at the moment. We can also challenge underlying attitudes, inaccurate beliefs and stereotypes that can contribute towards permissive attitudes towards those abusive behaviours. One word of caution is that in the literature around this topic, external practitioners who'd visited schools had reported that in the past, there have been occasional teachers who had undermined the programmes that they're delivering through unhelpful or factually incorrect information. So it's really important to consider which teachers are involved in teaching the topic area and whether they've accessed suitable training themselves. We also need to recognise what PSHE is not, what its limitations are, and what we'd want to avoid in lessons. So, for example, we'd want to avoid risking young people's rights to privacy by encouraging public disclosures, or asking pupils about their own experiences, which could be re-traumatising or too close to home for pupils with lived experience of domestic abuse. That's why it's really important to use distancing techniques, but I'll talk about that more in just a moment. Additionally, as with any other area of PSHE education, our curriculum needs to be well planned, allowing for a spiral curriculum that revisits and builds upon prior learning in a developmentally appropriate way. I know when something happens in the news or if there's something that's happened in the local area, it can be really tempting to address topics immediately in the classroom, but we really need to think about the kind of intensity of experience that brings for young people who may be aware of that or who may have connections to that incident. So we need to take care to consider whether that response best meets the needs of our pupils. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. In terms of what that spiral curriculum might look like, I'm showing some of the learning opportunities from our programme of study to model this at the moment. Our programme of study does include the statutory aspects of PSHE education, and we've broken it down so it considers how that might be approached key stage by key stage. You'll notice that a lot of them are quite broad. So this is for key stage 1 at the moment. And as Sally discussed earlier, there are layers and intersections in the experiences of individual children. And the few that I've identified here include aspects relating to help-seeking behaviours, identifying healthy and unhealthy relationship behaviours. So when that starts to become unhealthy and helping them to think about that outside of the context of their own relationships in an objective way, using scenarios, stories, characters. And those would then include abusive behaviours. It would also include aspects of learning about those kind of contribute aspects, like learning about emotions, learning about feelings and how they can be harmed, so that we can then understand how others' behaviours affect people's emotions and how that can then link into emotional abuse. Our programme of study is free to access, so I'm just going to pick out a couple of learning opportunities at each key stage to model this for you. So these yellow outcomes at the bottom are from key stage 1. So at key stage 1, pupils might learn about the importance of not keeping adult secrets. So something like only keeping kind of happy surprises secret that others will find out about eventually. But that it's important to tell someone like a teacher if they're worried that something in their family is making them feel unhappy or worried. We then build on this in key stage 2 with these kind of pink outcomes that I'm displaying here, drawing out more about when it's right to break confidence or to share a secret more broadly, recognising the shared characteristics of healthy family life and recognising if those family relationships are making them feel unhappy or unsafe. Stage 3, which I'm showing here in blue at the moment, we might want to more specifically explore the characteristics of abusive behaviours, recognising warning signs, knowing when that shift is where it's not any more healthy relationship behaviour, but it's something that is infringing on their right to their well-being, as well as how to report abusive behaviours or access support for themselves or others. From speaking to other PSHE leads and teachers, and as I pointed out, there can be a real barrier for friends reporting concerns about others, and we can help them to understand the positive role that they could play in someone else's life by helping that person to access support. We might also want to help them to identify services available to support healthy relationships and manage unhealthy relationships beyond that within our school and how to access those safely. In key stage 4, our students are much more likely to be in those early intimate relationships of their own, and we'd want them to understand the challenges that can be associated with getting help in domestic abuse situations of all kinds in order to be able to anticipate these and to help them to keep themselves safe while they're seeking that support. So we'd also want them to understand the importance of help seeking, have those ideas of support services in terms of those clear, appropriate services for their age and how they can access them. We'd also want our young people to have an understanding about the law relating to abuse in relationships, including coercive control and online harassment, if they don't already by this point. Embedding this into the curriculum rather than having it as a one-off lesson is recognised as a way to bring about more positive results, particularly when those programmes are long-term, such as your PSHE education curriculum. And your curriculum plan might look different to this one. This is just an example from one of our primary programme builders. However, what I wanted to emphasise here is that it's not that one-off lesson, but multiple points at which relationship behaviours and contributory factors, such as addressing those permissive attitudes about abusive behaviours, are addressed. And similarly, this one is from our secondary programme builders. You can see that it's revisited as students move through school, and it can be really helpful as a practice for you to sit with other people who are teaching PSHE education in your school and think about and plot out when you're teaching about domestic abuse specifically, but also about those contributing areas, so that you have a shared understanding about the intent behind your lessons as students move through school. In terms of best practice in keeping students safe in the classroom, the kind of things that would apply to any other topic within PSHE education apply just as much when you're teaching about domestic abuse. So we can consider how we make our learning environment safe for all pupils, including those with lived experience and vulnerability in relation to domestic abuse. So how we set ground rules, how we handle our pupils' questions safely. We can make sure that we're avoiding instruction about carrying out unhealthy or risky behaviours, and think about how we close our lessons safely. If you're coming to the other two sessions in the coming weeks, my colleagues Jenny and Liz will be exploring some of these in more detail. But for now, I'm going to focus on a couple of these. I'm going to focus on distancing learning, how we can ensure that our lessons are inclusive, considerations about the kind of media and image choices we make, and then how we can signpost support as well. So thinking first about distancing, as we've considered and mentioned, the range of young people who are experiencing domestic abuse isn't necessarily always apparent given the barriers that there can be in terms of them accessing support. So we don't always know in the moment who has lived experience of domestic abuse. And so instead of asking children about their own experiences of trauma or harm to begin a discussion, try instead to use examples like a character or a non-specific someone. I've given a couple of examples of resources that you might want to have a look at. On the left is an example from our consent pack for Key Stage 1, which explores giving consent and healthy friendships and relationships through named characters. On the right, there is an example from Medway Public Health Directorate's RSE resources, and that utilises a four-part story to kind of demonstrate the escalating controlling behaviours and isolation in that story, as well as examples of economic abuse, such as damage to property, limiting access to finances, and also emotional abuse. Sally has already highlighted some excellent work relating to exploring masculinity and preventing violence against women and girls. And I wanted to highlight some of the important aspects of the classroom around inclusivity, as domestic abuse includes people of any gender or sexual orientation. And I was reading a recent Gallup publication with a foreword that I was absolutely delighted to see was written by the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, Nicole, who's here today. And it highlighted some of the challenges that people within the LGBT community can experience, including rhetoric that perpetuates ideas that domestic abuse doesn't happen in same-sex relationships, which can then become a barrier to help seeking. So we need to make sure that that's addressed in our lessons. And I've got a couple of examples of how that might be done. So on the right is an example from our consent pack for Key Stage 4. The gender and sexual orientation of the characters isn't clear in this one, it's ambiguous. And there's also a secret referred to in the example, which in this case might be a reference to outing, which can be a particular concern within abusive behaviours in same-sex relationships. The example at the bottom is from Something's Not Right from the Home Office. And while that resource was developed for the context of returning to school from lockdowns, I've personally seen this adapted by teachers for use as we move away from this really successfully. And the scenario here is among other examples that includes clearly mixed sex couples, but this is an example that is distinctly regarding a same-sex relationship. Just to think briefly about kind of media choices and considering any kind of shock, fear, shame that might arise from the imagery we choose to use, when we educate young people about relationships, including abuse, we need to ensure that we don't make our children feel that they are being assumed to be future perpetrators of domestic abuse. So while childhood exposure, for example, to domestic abuse has been associated with higher rates of perpetration or victimisation in later life, practitioners in the field have really stressed that not all children exposed to domestic abuse will inevitably perpetrate or be victimised in their own relationships in later life, and that those assumptions can lead to biased practices across a range of practices. And we've got an ethical imperative to consider what messages we share in our teaching when we're teaching ourselves, but also in the kind of media we use in the classroom. So we need to assess whether the media we're considering was made for the audience we're using it for, so for students in the classroom. We need to question what assumptions it makes about students and consider whether it's going to cause fear among those who've experienced domestic abuse, for example. We also need to consider whether it perpetrates an extreme example of only one form of abuse to the neglect of other forms, and then how that might then affect help-seeking behaviours. I've shown an example of a resource here, which is from the University of Exeter. The reason I've highlighted this one is because the media used is inclusive, it doesn't aim to shock or shame, and it considers positive aspects of relationships as well. So while this one isn't a domestic abuse specific resource, it's one to take a look at to see how to kind of use that as a model. In terms of signposting to support in school, on the community level, on a national level, we know that prevention of domestic abuse can't be addressed just through curriculum-only approaches. So we need to support our students in accessing the resources that they need. It can help in our lessons to frame it to consider young people's rights, as they might not feel that that support is for them. And additionally, our young people will need to understand what happens when they seek support. So, for example, what happens if they call Childline? They need to know that it won't appear on the phone bill, but they do need to consider that it might appear on their phone's log itself, so they may need to clear that phone call log. Signposting is a common feature of any lesson plan that we quality assure or develop, but I wanted to just highlight a couple of examples. So, for example, there's a signposting activity where students specifically go through that process of considering what will happen next when something's not right. But also I wanted to highlight some of the kind of resources that are used around stalking and harassment. And this one in particular is from the Alice Ruggles Trust for Key Stages 4 and 5. Just before I hand over to John, I have some final top tips. Just remember that PSHE education is one aspect of a range of approaches to support and protect young people in school. So what pastoral support is available? What safe spaces are there available for young people if they need them? How does our teaching promote positive relationships, and how do we connect that with school ethos and values? What services does the school connect with to support students? Second, when you're teaching about these topics, make sure that all of your staff are aware. It's not always obvious who a child will talk to. So if you've been teaching about a topic, that can then increase the levels of disclosure and numbers of disclosures. So for example, if you're in primary schools, are your lunchtime assistants aware so that they have this knowledge that's being taught about as a context what they might be told by a young person or what they might overhear. And finally, before I hand over to John, when you're teaching, have a plan for pupils who have lived experience of domestic abuse that you know about, as well as those that you don't. So talk to your safeguarding pastoral teams before you teach. With older students, perhaps share your curriculum plan before they come to that lesson so that they know what's coming up and they can talk to someone first. And consider how a young person can leave that classroom safely if they need to. On that, I'm going to hand over to John, and he's going to talk a little bit about his school's approach and his classroom practice with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bethan. Hopefully colleagues will be able to see elements of what you've talked about in the lessons that we teach. I'm John Makepeace, and I'm the Deputy Head of Nord Green Junior School, which is in West London and Hounslow, relatively close to Heathrow Airport. We aim to reduce incidents of domestic violence at our school through teaching to recognise, like Sally said, what is and what is not a positive relationship. We teach about female role models and empowerment skills, and we teach children to know their rights off by heart. Unfortunately, we recognise that we are teaching potential future perpetrators and victims, and so we teach about the nature of bullying and of domestic violence. Change slide, please. Before I talk about our approach as a school, I want to give you a bit of a context of our school. We're a single standalone academy in Hounslow Local Authority, and we work closely with the local authority and with neighbouring schools. So that's years 3 to 6, 7 to 11-year-olds. We have 4-class intake and approximately 460 children. We do have extremely high cases of domestic violence in the homes of our pupils. So much so that our work was becoming disproportionately focused on that. Myself, the other deputy head teacher and the head teacher, and less so on teaching and learning. So in February 2019, we employed my colleague who sat next to me here, Stephen, our pastoral leader, whose main focus was really to do with safeguarding and work with families, the majority of which are connected with domestic violence, unfortunately. Both Stephen and I have worked with Hounslow Local Authority's Learning to Respect group, which is a multi-agency group where we work with police, colleagues who work in women's refuges, Hounslow housing, youth workers, to go into schools and talk to teachers about how to talk about domestic violence with children. And we've been recently asked by Housing Local Authority to be a lead school and help other schools with that. Change slide, please. By signing up to this, I know that colleagues who work in the schools will be doing great things already in terms of all PSHE will be contributing to children forming positive relationships as part of lifelong learning. Maybe there'll be something that you can take from the work that we do as well, which might be helpful. But I want to reassure you, I know that what you're doing is good. There are two main strategies that we have in our approach to anti-domestic violence and gender equality. The first is the borough-wide initiative Learning to Respect, which we've taught for 15 years, year on year, and we've honed our practice. And the second is a whole school topic, which lasts 6 weeks, and we call it Significant Individuals. Change slide, please. For the Learn to Respect topic, we break it down to 3 main aims. And for each one, I've illustrated it with an example lesson from a different year group. The first aim is about teaching children what a positive relationship is and skills associated around it. We use a book with year 3, Anthony Brown's Piggy Book, which is about a mum who gets exploited at home and everything gets put upon her and she has to wait on everyone. And really the impact from that lesson is you can see the children's understanding that actually men and women are equal and everybody needs to contribute equally. And in that lesson, we don't tell children that men should be doing this or women should be doing that, but it should be a choice and that everybody has to pull their weight. Our second aim is connected to knowledge and understanding relating to conflict and bullying. And we teach that in every year group. I'm going to choose an example from year 4, where we share our school's anti-bullying policy, the children's version. There's a copy in every classroom and it was written by the children and it's got photographs and it's very child friendly. What's important is that children know and do go to it throughout different times of the year, and it's something which they own. The impact from the lesson is that children can identify what a healthy friendship is and feelings associated with being left out and what to do if they suspect bullying. Our third aim is about empowerment. It's about further development of gender equality and raising self-esteem. I've chosen a year 5 lesson to illustrate this. In this lesson, the children play games and then they pause in between games and reflect with the teacher on the sorts of team skills and cooperative skills which help them to be successful, and then relate that to their play outside and see that as important skills in their lifelong learning. Change slide, please. We do directly approach the topic of domestic violence, and this is taught by senior leaders in the school. It is a challenging lesson and we've thought about it a great deal, and we've actually evaluated and changed practice over the years. The children watch a short animation, which are real scenarios spoken by actors. After watching it, we relate what they've seen to our school values. And we talk about the different types of domestic violence. And so they list three of those types, and we don't deal with sexual violence being key stage 2. The children then explore how they feel the different characters may be feeling from the impact of domestic violence and try and empathise. And then with the children, we give them tools and give them practical examples of what happens if. Call 999 in case of emergency. Like we heard from earlier speakers, talk to a trusted adult, such as a teacher. And also, every child in our school knows a child line number and what to expect if they call it. The impact, I know that every child in our school, before they leave and before they start their next key stage, knows that they have a trusted adult in their life who says that this behaviour is unacceptable and it's illegal. We know some children in every class who are living with domestic violence, and of course there'll be children who are living with domestic violence who we don't know about. And unfortunately, that would be the case with colleagues as well. Next slide, please. Our other strategy is something that I'm particularly proud of, and it's something that the children absolutely love. We call it significant individual topic. It lasts for 6 weeks and it runs in every year group. We know that domestic violence is a form of bullying where one party has more power over the other and exploits that power. To ensure that both boys and girls develop an understanding of gender equality, that's really at the centre of this topic, because domestic violence is at its heart about gender inequality, and this topic tackles that. It starts off with a series of English lessons where the teacher will model research and writing a biography about a strong female role model, and the children will replicate writing that biography. And then comes the exciting part, where the children are presented with a whole raft of books on strong female role models, and they will get to choose their own with a partner to write about, copying the same model that they learned previously in writing a biography. And it's significant that they get to choose, because it's not done to them. Education isn't done to them. It's about them being in the driving seat. It's about them making decisions, and that's a pathway for them making decisions in their own lives and being in charge. Alongside these lessons, we teach communication, thinking and learning skills such as public speaking, cooperation, resilience and resourcefulness. And children have metacognition lessons. So they reflect on the role model, think about not just what the role models achieved, but the barriers they had to overcome to achieve that. They think about their goals that they have achieved in their life, and it could be as simple as learning to read or riding a bike or swimming, and the barriers they overcame in achieving those goals. They think about their next steps and the stepping stones to achieve them, and they think about aspirationally what they want to achieve when they're older. The topic culminates with a speech from the child about their role model and how they have reflected on their own personal journey. Watching the children in class talk with pride and confidence is, I think, the real learning. Next slide, please. As part of the topic, we've asked previous pupils and pupils from other local schools who have grown up to be young, successful women to answer questions on videos for our pupils. And this is quite amazing to watch the children in our school looking at young women who've been successful in many different fields. One example is an ex-pupil of mine who did a master's in engineering and is working for Toyota in the Midlands. We've got another young lady ex-pupil who is studying politics at Bristol. And it's great for the children to see the possibilities and choices that they have in front of them in their futures. Next slide, please. During lockdown, it became more and more apparent through phone calls to home some of the difficulties some families were facing. And we started meeting weekly in pupils causing concern meetings, the leadership team with the Senko and pastoral lead. And this was a way of triaging problems that had been flagged up by teachers to make sure that no child slipped through the net that we were made aware of, and that we could agree on actions to follow up. The majority of these were to do with domestic violence. As a UNICEF rights respecting school, we ensure that every child knows that their rights are by heart, and I hope that stays with them for the rest of their lives. We, of course, acknowledge the White Ribbon Day, and in the autumn, we make sure that all parents are aware of our commitment to that as well. And next week, International Women's Day is something that we teach lessons on, and we have assemblies about. We have weekly PSHE lessons from a published scheme, which we've honed and made our own, and those contribute to children's lifelong social skills and emotional intelligence, which I'm sure many colleagues here will be doing as well. Twice weekly circle time. On a Friday, the children finish the week by nominating each other and celebrating each other's successes so that their self-esteem is raised, and we have wellbeing lessons. We start every academic year by suspending the formal curriculum and working on positive relationships, learning behaviour and pride in their own identity. We recognise that lunchtimes are a key time to teach social skills when children have greater freedom. And so we've employed sports coaches to help children to develop independent skills in terms of being able to get along with each other. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you. That was amazing. And we've got some time left at the end for a few questions. I'm going to try and get through as many as we can. So the first one is, any recommendations for resources that support students that are have low literacy ability but a very developed verbal understanding? Because some of the case studies that are available are quite word heavy. So have any practitioners got any recommendations of stuff that they've used? I mean, if not, that's something we could perhaps follow up in the post event information.
Paula, this is Sally. So,
Sally.
So as part of Your Best Friend, we are developing quite a lot of resources, and some of them with specific to address specific needs around that. If there's BSL interpretation required, or we've got like a stack of Instagram posts which really convey like quite complex issues in a simple graphic and few words. And so some of that is already on the Your Best Friend website, which we will share afterwards. But then if you sign up to the mailing list, you'll just get those resources as they're produced will be shared. So we've got a film. So again, if they just want to watch something that is about healthy, unhealthy relationships, how to spot the signs. And then also some podcasts that are going to come out. So again, if young people prefer to listen and not read or watch, there'll be that. So we've got some stuff and create some stuff as well.
Fantastic. We'll make sure that's passed on. Thank you. Any suggestions for discussions with Key Stage 5? Open that one up.
Hi, sorry, Bethan. Yeah, we are currently developing resources to build on our Key Stage 1 to 4 consent lessons that are going into Key Stage 5, and also the Alice Ruggles Trust has resources for Key Stages 4 into 5 available on unhealthy relationship behaviours, which touch on this, but also include thinking about like the kind of relationship that they're entering into at that point in their lives. So thinking about issues like harassment, non-consensual things like that. All of those aspects are explored through those resources.
Great. And again, we can put the links in for that. This is a general question about children under 16 that display the same kind of behaviours as a domestic abuse perpetrator. How is that defined in law? Probably one for Nicole, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question because it's come up quite a lot throughout COVID, for example, when we've been, as Commissioner, drawing together what was at one point weekly and sometimes twice weekly, and now is more like monthly meetings with service providers in England and Wales. The adolescent to parent violence has come up quite strongly across frontline services. And so I have put in our chat, which I'm sure we'll share with the wider group, a couple of resources. I think there's one that is a little bit older, but it's from the Home Office, and it's kind of a guide to resources that are there. And then I commissioned a literature review in relation to this, just as a way to prompt kind of bringing together of the research and the understanding and practice, and with the hope that we have, again, a bit more concentration across government in really helping to define what are the service pathways for these types of situations. But it clearly is part of domestic abuse. It's within the family context. And obviously, when it's abuse of a child, we're talking that then is defined as child abuse, but adolescent to parent violence. And you know, it's worth saying that a fourth of our domestic homicides are adult children who kill a parent. So I'm not saying that one leads necessarily to the other, but it's a significant kind of underdeveloped area of work. There are some really good, again, in pockets, some good services that are out there that really specifically look at adolescent to parent violence and what those resources are. But there's a real need to have kind of a more strategic approach to how we develop those services. But I would be happy to share some of the ones that I am aware of that are out there, and certainly the research kind of highlights some of the key services to point towards. But it is a growing concern, I have to say, and so it's really something that perhaps when we think about the guidance and some of the work that you'll be bringing together as a department, it could be something that we could focus on a bit more.
Thank you. Another general question, really. In your experiences, how difficult is it to prove a charge for domestic abuse if it's not a physical or sexual abuse case, where the evidence is more clear-cut?
It doesn't necessarily have to be difficult to prove, but it's a complex question to answer. We have, first of all, I think it's worth saying the vast majority of victims of domestic abuse won't have police involvement, and that's really important for us. I think we often make that assumption, and then to some degree, as some services are triggered, people will say, "Well, have you talked to the police? Where's kind of you know, what is the background and kind of the?" I mean, certainly it wouldn't be in your context, but in others, you know, the quote unquote proof of domestic abuse. And there's an assumption that there will have been a disclosure to police. So the vast majority, 5 out of 6 people may not have talked to the police. When they do, there's a huge percentage of attrition. In other words, the reporting may be an initial arrest, but no further action. There's a real need for the police to improve some of the way that they gather evidence and talk to victims, frankly, about kind of what their options are and what they may or may not do. I'm not pushing a criminal justice approach at all costs, but I think there's a lot of improvement that needs to be made in terms of how confident victims feel in kind of engaging, maybe talking to the police about further evidence, the police then taking advantage of knowing what is there, wider evidence other than, say, the victim's statement alone. And so there's a huge need to improve those types of things. And I think the reason why we all have to know that is just to understand for the families that we're interacting with what life is like. You know, what is the most likely outcome, and also just the barriers and fears that people have as to why they may not fully disclose. Why children and adults involved in domestic abuse may have huge fears about what the consequences will be if they disclose, or if they take that to be honest, which is why, I mean, I have to just say how struck I am by listening to John and the work happening at his school, and that, you know, all of that way that you build an environment where you're so much more likely to have more of a trusted relationship and an ability to feel you could take that step and talk about some of these things. So it's pretty impressive. And I think if anything, if we could achieve a lot more activity within schools that sounds a lot like John's school, I'm sure it's out there, and that's part of our challenge collectively, is knowing where it is and acknowledging it and really emphasizing what exceptionally good practice it is and how it changes people's lives.
Great, thank you. We're running out of lots of good questions, but I'm only going to be able to fit a small number in now. So this is a good practical question, I think, for practitioners. Do you recommend content warnings prior to lessons, specifically to domestic abuse, or should they be designed in a way that can be delivered to everyone, knowing that students can leave if they feel uncomfortable during the lesson?
John, would you like to start from your perspective in primary?
Yeah, I think it's obviously different in different key stages. I think what's important is, in terms of key stage 2, key stage 1, is that you know the class well, and you know who's in the class, and you tailor it to the children in the class, making sure that you're careful. What we do is we let parents know in advance of the lessons so that they can talk to their children, because some of the nature of the lessons is upsetting, but it's making sure that, like Nicole says, you have the culture of safeguarding and protecting children and do it in a nurturing way.
And it's not these aren't lessons that the children can be withdrawn from.
Yeah.
Just to kind of add from a context of Key Stage 3 to Key Stage 5, that generally my practice when I was in schools was to share the curriculum ahead of time so that students could speak to someone if they needed to in that time, but obviously, of course, to speak to pastoral staff, speak to the safeguarding team as well.
Thank you. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to start to bring this to a close. It's flown by, and I've personally just enjoyed sitting on this so much and hearing everyone speak. And thank you all for coming, and thank you all for dialing into this and sparing some time, because I know you're all busy, and I hope you found it useful. As I said, we will send out a pack of information. It might take us a while, but we'll try and look through the questions and pick up those that we weren't able to answer today, and get those important links out to you for further information. You'll also get a happy sheet, as I used to call it when I was in training, to complete on this event. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that most of you will be able to make our other two. I mean, next week's session is about pornography. And then the Wednesday after that, we have a further session about sexual exploitation. And I hope that there may be more to come. So please be honest in your feedback. And thanks, everyone. And have a nice evening.